They say every generation gets the world it deserves, but what if one generation never really got the world at all? Right in the middle of two of the loudest generations in recent history, there's a group sitting quietly. Nobody called them special. Nobody called them lazy. Honestly, nobody called them much of anything. That's Generation X, born roughly between the late 1960s and early 1980s. They grew up letting themselves into empty houses. They watched families fall apart, governments lie, economies shift, and they learned early that nothing is as solid as it looks. This is a real look at what it does to a person, to an entire generation, to grow up unseen, to build a life on self-reliance you never chose, and to get so good at disappearing that you almost forget you deserve to be found. Let's get into it. There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't come with a dramatic story. Not heartbreak, not tragedy. Just the quieter loneliness of being fully present in your own life and still not registering on anyone's radar. Gen X knows that feeling, not as a passing mood, as a background hum. Open any conversation about generations and watch what happens. Boomers get credit for reshaping the post-war world. Millennials get dissected from every angle: their anxiety, their debt, their mental health on every podcast and magazine cover. Gen Z gets handed the future, Gen X gets a footnote. But being overlooked didn't start with algorithms, it started in childhood, in quiet houses, in the specific silence of a world too distracted to say, "We see you." Think about what it means to be the middle child of history. You don't get the reverence of the firstborn or the indulgence of the youngest. You learn to take up less space, to need things less loudly, to find your own way, not because anyone decided you were ready, but because no one was watching closely enough to notice you might need help. They adapted, got self-sufficient, learned irony because sincerity kept getting met with indifference. And here's what psychology knows about growing up invisible: it's never neutral. The nervous system adjusts. The self learns to expect less. That person grows into an adult who is remarkably capable, quietly lonely, and genuinely unsure why. When everything looks fine, something still feels a little off. That's where a lot of Gen X is sitting right now, not broken, just carrying something unspoken, the weight of a childhood spent becoming capable before anyone checked if they were okay. What does it do to a whole generation to spend a lifetime being the ones who keep going quietly without anyone asking how they're doing? That question deserves an honest answer. Picture a key, worn smooth from being handled so often. It hangs around the neck of a kid, maybe 8, maybe 9. And every afternoon when school lets out, while other kids head toward waiting parents, this kid walks a different direction. Toward a quiet house, toward a door they open themselves. They were called latchkey kids, both parents working, divorce rates climbing, the traditional family structure quietly coming apart. Millions of kids came home to houses that were structurally fine and emotionally hollow. They managed their own snacks, their own homework, their own fears about the dark and the silence. And the world called it independence. It wasn't. Real independence grows from a safe foundation, from being held and guided enough to trust yourself. What latchkey kids built was competence forged from necessity. That psychological gap follows you for decades without you realizing it. When caregiving is absent, the brain learns to stop broadcasting need, to internalize, to shrink down to a size that fits inside an empty room. That's not a character flaw, it's a survival strategy. But survival strategies built in childhood don't switch off when the childhood ends. The kid who learned to be okay in the silence grows into the adult who insists they're fine when they're not, who feels genuinely uncomfortable accepting help, not out of pride, but because something deep in them stopped expecting it. There's a specific exhaustion that comes with this, the tiredness of someone who has been strong so long they barely remember what it felt like to lean on someone, whose self-reliance has been praised so many times that "you're so capable" stopped feeling like a compliment and started feeling like an instruction. Keep going, don't stop, don't ask. Gen X received those instructions early, and what never gets named rarely gets healed. It just becomes the water you swim in, the quiet, persistent sense of being more alone than everyone around you, even in a room full of people who love you. There's an experiment that changed how psychology understands the need to be noticed. A mother sits across from her baby, warm, responsive, mirroring its expressions. The baby is lit up, then the mother's face goes blank. She doesn't leave, she just stops responding. Within seconds, the baby starts reaching, trying everything to get the connection back, and when nothing works, something shifts. The baby turns inward, goes quiet. This is the still face experiment. What it shows is simple and devastating. Humans don't just need someone to be there, they need someone to actively respond. Without that, something in us starts to go quiet. Now imagine that experiment lasting years, not out of cruelty, but because the adults around a child were stretched thin by economic pressure, fractured marriages, the relentless pace of the 70s and 80s. A generation of children sending signals into rooms too depleted to reflect them back. Instead of developing emotional flexibility, the brain develops what researchers call a heightened vigilance response, a constant low-level scan of the environment. The nervous system learns to be its own alarm system because the outside world proved unreliable. Psychologist John Bowlby called this the internal working model, an unconscious blueprint for relationships formed by early caregiving. For a lot of Gen X, that blueprint carries one message: people are unreliable. Self-reliance is the only thing you can count on. So they became the colleague who stays late and never mentions it. The friend who shows up for everyone's crisis and vanishes before their own. The partner who is devoted and somehow always slightly out of reach. Not because they don't feel things, but because some foundational part of them learned that being fully seen isn't safe. But here's what neuroscience also tells us: the brain isn't fixed. It keeps reorganizing in response to new, consistent, safe experiences. The technical term is neuroplasticity. The human version: it is never too late to be seen. There's a specific kind of smile Gen X perfected. Not warm, not cold, somewhere precisely in the middle. Slightly tilted, faintly amused, it says, "I've already seen how this ends and I've made my peace with it." It's the smile of someone who grieved something they were never allowed to call grief. The cultural image of Gen X has always leaned on detachment, the slacker aesthetic, the ironic distance, the refusal to be caught caring. The world called that apathy. It was never apathy. What the world kept misreading as a shrug was a generation quietly carrying unprocessed grief. Grief with no funeral, no language, no permission to say, "This hurt, this is still hurting." They were grieving families that fell apart. The US divorce rate peaked right through their most formative years. They were grieving institutions they'd been told to trust and watched fail. They were grieving a promised future, steady jobs, affordable housing that was expiring just as they came of age. And underneath all of that, they were grieving a childhood where someone was reliably, warmly paying attention. Grief that can't be named doesn't disappear, it transforms. Unprocessed grief shows up as emotional withdrawal, chronic cynicism, a reflex to deflect tenderness with humor, not because the tenderness isn't wanted, but because the nervous system learned to treat openness as a risk. Irony is the armor grief wears when it hasn't been given permission to cry. And because Gen X wore that armor so convincingly, the world accepted it as personality. The detachment got admired. The grief stayed unnamed. There's a term in trauma psychology for this: disenfranchised grief. Grief the culture doesn't validate as real loss. The latchkey kid told self-reliance is a gift. The generation handed cynicism instead of being asked, just once, what did it actually feel like when the things you were supposed to trust let you down? Gen X never got that question, so the smile stayed, carrying underneath it something that had always been grief. There's a specific kind of vertigo that has nothing to do with heights. It shows up in ordinary moments: scrolling your phone, watching a news segment about the generation behind you. Something shifts, not dramatically, just a clear, quiet recognition. The world has moved on, and it didn't stop to ask if you were coming. The 90s should have been Gen X's decade, and in a lot of ways it was grunge, independent film, the early internet crackling with real possibility. For a moment, the conversation was tuned to their frequency. Then it shifted. Millennials arrived. And with them came a cultural conversation about mental health, emotional language, and generational trauma that Gen X had quietly needed for years. It was necessary, but think about what it feels like to be the person who needed the same thing and watch it arrive for someone else instead. Therapists see this in siblings, the older child who struggled silently, watching the family finally learn emotional presence, but only for the younger one. What surfaces isn't jealousy, it's grief arriving late and sideways. Gen X sat with that feeling largely alone because the psychological trait their childhood installed, don't need too loudly, just keep going, made it nearly impossible to say, we needed this too, we're still here. Then midlife showed up, managing aging parents, raising kids they were determined to parent differently, navigating careers restructured by technology they helped build. They became what family systems theory calls the identified capable one, the person everyone leans on, whose own needs stay permanently in the background. Through all of it, the cultural conversation kept scrolling past. And somewhere in the middle of midlife, a question surfaces, quietly, undeniably, is this it? Hold everything together for everyone and nobody notices it's costing you something. That's not self-pity, that's just the beginning of something honest. There's a word that follows Gen X everywhere, offered consistently as their defining trait. Resilient, always meant as a compliment. Resilience is one of psychology's most celebrated ideas, the ability to absorb difficulty and keep going, but there are two very different kinds and we don't always distinguish between them. The first grows from security, from being held through hard things. It's warm. It carries the memory of not having to face difficulty alone. The second grows from necessity, from facing difficulty with no other option. It works. It's impressive, but it carries no warmth. Just the cold, efficient knowledge that you got through it because getting through was the only move available. Gen X broadly developed the second kind, and that kind has a cost the complement of resilient never acknowledges. It looks like genuinely not being able to accept help as a nervous system response, not a principle. It looks like being brilliant in a crisis and falling apart in the ordinary moments, because the nervous system that trained under pressure never learned to inhabit stillness. It looks like being the strong one in every room for decades, and carrying beneath that strength a loneliness so normalized it's become invisible even to yourself. Researcher Bessel van der Kolk describes how survival responses live in the body, in the chronic tension in the jaw and shoulders, in the exhaustion that isn't about sleep. It's the continuous effort of being your own entire support system. Contemporary psychology has a concept called earned security, the idea that adults who didn't get secure attachment as kids can develop it later through therapy, through genuinely safe relationships, through slowly letting the nervous system update its beliefs about what connection is allowed to feel like. It's real, it's possible. But it requires asking, actually asking, letting the internal experience surface and be witnessed without retreating behind "I'm fine, I've always been fine." You can be genuinely resilient and genuinely exhausted by your own resilience. Acknowledging the cost doesn't cancel the strength, it just makes it, finally, fully human. There's something that happens when a person is finally, genuinely seen, not evaluated, not praised for their resilience, just seen, witnessed in the full, honest complexity of who they actually are beneath all the years of quiet adaptation. It doesn't always feel the way you'd expect. Sometimes it feels like relief so deep it arrives as grief. There's a moment when the story you've been telling about yourself starts to loosen, not collapse, loosen. The story that said, "I am the capable one, I don't need, I don't ask, I don't lean," that story starts to show itself for what it always was, not truth, not identity, adaptation. And adaptation belongs to the environment that required it. When safety shows up, when someone sits across from you and actually stays, the adaptation doesn't have to be the whole of you anymore. That's what being seen makes possible, not erasing what was built in the hard years, expanding beyond it. For Gen X, this is happening, quietly, in therapy rooms where the latchkey experience is finally being named, in honest conversations between friends who grew up in the same emotional landscape and are maybe for the first time actually talking about what it cost them. In private moments when someone reads a sentence that describes their inner life so accurately they have to put everything down and just sit with it. Someone else knows this, I'm not the only one who carried this. Consider what Gen X actually built inside all of that difficulty. A generation of parents who broke cycles because they knew from the inside exactly what those cycles cost. Careers built through recessions. families held together through fractures, an interior life developed in the margins of everyone else's story, rich, precise, deeply human. That's not nothing, that's extraordinary. Needing to be seen was never weakness. Being seen now doesn't undo what was built in the years of not being seen. It adds to it, deepens it, gives it the witness it always deserved. You're not too late to be known. And the generation that kept going quietly, without applause, is still here, still hopping. Someone might eventually ask, "How are you, really? How are you?" And this time having enough safety to answer honestly. This chapter is for you, not for a demographic. For the actual person who watched this whole thing and felt, somewhere quiet inside, a recognition they weren't entirely prepared for. You kept going. Through the empty houses and the fractured families and the institutions that promised security and delivered disappointment. Through decades of being the capable one, the one who held it all together so smoothly that no one thought to ask what it was costing you. You kept going, and somewhere along the way you may have stopped expecting to be asked. This is that pause. Think about the interior cost, not the achievements. The years of self-soothing in quiet rooms, the grief that never got a funeral, the needs folded away so efficiently they became invisible even to yourself. What it took to carry all of that and still show up for everyone who needed you. What it took was everything, and you gave it without ceremony. There are millions of people who grew up with that same key around their neck, who came home to that same quality of silence, who learned the same art of needing nothing publicly while feeling everything privately. They're here, you're among them, and the acknowledgement, late as it is real. The part of you that hoped someone might eventually see beneath the surface, that hope was never weakness. That was the most human thing about you. If you'd like to stay connected, subscribe, no pressure, just an open door. And if something here stirred something you've been carrying alone, leave it in the comments. Your words might be exactly what makes someone else feel a little less alone in theirs. The middle child of history has been quiet for a very long time. There's no requirement to speak, but if you want to, this is a safe place to do it. To the generation that came home to empty houses and learned to be okay in them. To the generation that watched the world fracture and quietly held the pieces together. To the generation that kept going when going was the only option. Take care of yourself, you have earned every gentleness.